I climbed up to the mountaintop.
My name is Ruth E.J. Booth. My pronouns are she, they, and I'd like to welcome you to Game Studies in the Wild. That's Game Studies in the Wild, and just to clarify, that's not what happens when us researchers get just a little bit too absorbed in Pokemon Go and wander into the lion enclosure at the local zoo. Now, before we get started, I do want to explain some of my thinking behind this panel. You'll already be aware, if you've been attending Playway Festival the rest of this week, of the huge possibilities of games and gaming technology, from concerts and chiptune artists to amazing fundraisers from the likes of Games Done Quick, the work of women in games, and of course the fantastic work of Tinderbox and the Scottish Games Network. Game studies research can go beyond the industry and the academy. You can find it in language learning, in emotional well-being, live event streaming, and tons more. So in this panel, we're looking at some research projects that explore applications of game studies outside the industry. And to help me out, I've brought in three pals here. I've got Charlie Harbord from the Kilted Otter Initiative. We've got Gabriel Elvery from Digital Fantastic, and music researcher Arthur Ellinger to talk about the work that they've been doing, taking game studies out of the academy. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Charlie Harbord. Charlie, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, sure. So Charlie Harbord, as Ruth quite correctly said there, I work at Abertay University. I'm also a PhD student there, almost hopefully finished on my PhD, focused on role-playing games to enhance the mutual second language acquisition of both Mandarin and English. But I also founded the Kilted Otter Initiative, which is a research-based extended Gaelic game jam all about preserving Scots language, Scots culture, and Indigenous heritage.
So how did it get started, Charlie?
So the Kilted Otter Initiative is something that started off as a drunken idea, as all good things do. Chatting with a very good friend in Colombia who has Tangrande y Ugando, which is grown but still playing. And we were talking about the Games Jam work that she does and how Indigenous languages should be preserved. And then we came up with this idea. So I've spent about 8 years of my life living in China, and I've lived in Italy. I've spent so long in other people's cultures and other people's heritages that I realized I've not really done much for my own. And that is something that I felt a bit bad about, because I've loved sharing and enjoying other people's cultures. So I wanted to bring my culture to the world. And so that was how the Kilted Otter Initiative started. The mascot for Tangrande Ugando is an otter. And so we wanted to kind of join forces, and we thought, what better way than to stick a kilt on an otter? And so I drew the little mascot that we have. Yeah, and he makes me happy. So there you go.
Oh, that's lovely. I'm not sure if this has been used in any of the promotional materials, but if you check out my Twitter later, I will be sharing Charlie Harbord's otter, so you can just see what an amazing mascot the Kilted Otter is. So you've talked about how this was kind of inspired by the way you wanted to uplift Gaelic Celtic culture, the Gaelic language, and all of that kind of thing. But it does kind of rise out of work that you've been doing with language and with games.
No, absolutely. It started with, my original degree is Mandarin and Chinese culture, and then I did a postgrad in international education. All the while, I've been a gamer, and I also worked as a game localization expert in China. So then I got the chance to do my PhD, and of course, language and culture, with it being so important, that's where I drew my inspiration from. And so the first and most obvious choice for me was to use Mandarin, because I have an understanding of both languages and cultures. I've studied in both Scotland and in China within universities. So it put me in a unique position to understand a little bit more about sort of like educational pedagogies, learning cultures, that kind of thing. So this Gaelic project feeds directly from my PhD. And so for my PhD, I've made an RPG, and I've made it twice, once in English, once in Mandarin. But the whole point is the model is there. You can slot out any language and put in a new language. And it's the collaborative aspect that I'm really focused on. And in times of COVID, anything that can encourage collaboration is always going to be a winner for me.
That's fantastic. And I know you can't talk too much about this at the moment, but I understand you've had some interest from some other Indigenous cultures in getting involved in related projects to this.
Yes, I'm extremely honoured to have been approached by an elder from the, and I'm going to say this wrong, but it's the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation in Canada. And he approached me to help him or teach him to make an app that he can then use as sort of a growing dictionary to categorize and preserve, curate Indigenous languages, but also the dialects. The same as in Scotland, all of our dialects are so diverse that what someone says in Dundee isn't the same as Glasgow, that kind of thing. And something that Morris Switzer, this is the elder, that said to me that has really struck home for me is nothing about us without us. So I'm not going to make an app for him because it's not my culture, but I can teach him how to make an app and then he can use it. And that's the same for the Kilted Otter. We want to have local Indigenous Scots Gaelic speakers involved in every step as much as we possibly can. So we will be including Scots musicians, Scots actors, Scots singers as much as we can.
Very briefly, before I move on to Gabriel Elvery's work, I like this idea that you've kind of got this whole idea of collaboration, nothing about us without us, sort of built into the project from the beginning. I wouldn't like to move on without mentioning your work with the Women in Games conference, of course, which I think this whole idea of enabling people to make their own games and talk about things that and to create things that they want to talk about as well.
Yeah, again, I mean, I've been extremely lucky in my work and study life to have had these amazing opportunities, and it's purely because I've known pretty awesome people. And so for Women in Games, I have the delight of being their applied games designer in residence, which, you know, put that on a CV. I'm also their Twitch moderator and their Twitch streamer coordinator. So it's all about getting and enabling women and non-gender binary and anyone that forum where you can spread out, where you can learn stuff, where you're not afraid to put your hand up and say, actually, I don't understand, can you help me? So Women in Games is very, very important for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Charlie. I'd like to invite Gabriel Elvery to unmute and join us now at this point.
Hi.
Would you like to introduce yourself, your pronouns and all that kind of thing?
Sure. So I'm Gabe and I am a second year PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow. I like to do lots of stuff, the Games and Gaming Lab, dip into fantasy here and there. And my research is kind of mainly focused on some fantasy stuff, bit of the fantastic, and a lot about affect and social interaction in games and things like that.
Excellent. Okay. So your current doctoral work, as you said, is primarily touches on aspects of affect, parasociality, fantasy games. I mean, we'll come to the rest of this shortly, but first of all, obviously, the big question is why fantasy games in particular?
So it's funny because I came to Glasgow to do the MLit, which was the first fantasy MLit ever. And when I went, it was so very different from studying like English literature, and the way that students talk to each other and express their interest about fantasy was very different. And a lot of it was connected to their memories of the literature and their love for it rather than being analytical. which was like very different from me. I come from quite a more like analytical standpoint, and it kind of got me wondering like what's different about these fantasy worlds. So people get so immersed in fantasy worlds and they care so much about books and games. I mean, look at like the cultural phenomena of like Game of Thrones and, dare I say, Harry Potter and things like that. And the way that people get so invested in it. So actually like video games take this a step further, and I like to think, what is the fantasy in particular doing? So why can we feel things for these fantastical characters? Why do we care about this dragon? why are we doing jobs for these people? And so I think moving from fantasy literature into video games in general, because video games are a construction. Even if they look realistic, they are a digital fantasy world that we've created and that we inhabit sometimes. So I find it really interesting to think about like what those worlds are doing and also what they're saying, and even thinking about ethical considerations of what are games doing, what are they saying? Are they creating fantasies that we want to be a part of, or are they kind of perpetuating more like harmful fantasies that can damage people? So it's about digging into the games and digging into the fantasies and deconstructing them just as much as we would with a piece of literature, for example.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point, and I'm interested in what you brought up about the fantasy course and the whole idea of the ways in which people sort of approached the different fantasy texts like games and things like that from their own perspectives and their own like past interactions to them. You know, particularly thinking about fandom and things like that. I mean, how do games affect our relationships to one another?
So I feel like fantasy in particular, because it is slightly divorced from kind of more realistic things, it kind of creates a shared language that people use. So it's like you can talk about a character or talk about what like house you're in Game of Thrones rather than disclose personal information about yourself. So it kind of, there's realism in there, but it's kind of over the top of it. If you put the fantasy there, it kind of acts maybe as like a bit of a social lubricant. It makes things easier to talk about. It makes people open up more because they're not talking about something that looks real. It's, you know, oh, it's fantasy. But, you know, we don't, it's the case that we're learning that we shouldn't dismiss these things so quickly or locate them just in childhood, because fantasy and fandom and kind of communal activity is something that we can all share throughout our lives. And yes, I'll be looking at particularly, thanks for popping that in the chat, I'm doing a workshop later which is about parasocial interaction. So it's about how and why we feel things for fictional things and people. So I'll be talking about some of the theories behind it and like looking at some of the like the techniques that maybe developers can use to create that kind of parasocial relationship. And then we'll play a game together. So we'll be using the fantasy of the game to kind of hang out and pick what to do together and dating some ghosts. So that should be a lot of fun. That's at 8 o'clock. So I hope some of you can pop over to that.
I'll definitely be looking forward to that, and obviously you'll be talking more about your research then. But I can't move on to Arthur without having asked you about sociality games, and particularly how this has affected things during the pandemic. Would you like to talk a little bit about the work that you've done around Animal Crossing and why it's become so popular during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure. So I wrote a piece for the Games and Gaming Lab blog, which was about how people have been using Animal Crossing New Horizons during the pandemic. It's become insanely popular. And I think part of the reason, so it's fantasy, but you're doing all of these very mundane, like these normal things, right? So we're kind of using games not as an escape, but almost like simulating what normality feels like. So it's like we can go into Animal Crossing, we can have the fantasy of a normal life, a normal day, we can go get a coffee, we can hang out with people, and we can do these soothing little things. But there's so much meaning behind it, because in the game, you can choose what you do. So you might be doing these normal things that could be classified as work, but it's up to you what you do. It's up to you how you manage your time. And I think those small moments of making those decisions, it just makes everything more meaningful. So I think what's great to remember, especially with the pandemic, it puts things into perspective, because when we're playing a game, we're not lost. We're not just, you know, hold up looking at a screen and there's nothing there. There's stuff going on behind it. And a lot of the reason we engage with media is for a form of social interaction. And games can give us a bit of like, they can't replace all social interaction, but they can decrease the social deficits we have and kind of help us build up a bit of resilience so that we can face the rest of the day and the scary landscape of things at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gabe.
Thanks.
Before I move on to Arthur, I just want to point out our fantastic Tinderbox mods are in the chat right now. They're not only posting links to where you can find out more information about our speakers today, they're also gathering your questions, which we can put to all of our speakers here today a little bit later on in this session. So if you've got any questions about to Charlie, to Gabe, or to Arthur, about anything they've talked about, or you have any further ideas you want to explore, you want to have our panel explore today, just stick them in the chat and the mods will feed them back to us. So thank you. Last but not least, I think it's time we moved on to Arthur Erlinger, our final speaker today. Arthur, if you'd like to introduce yourself, your pronouns, the work you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, so hello everyone. So I'm Arthur. I'm a first-year PhD student in music at the University of Glasgow. And my research takes a look at live music streaming, which is basically a musician playing live music during live streams, which shares many similarities with game live streaming, which brought me here today.
Obviously, the whole idea about music live streaming is going to be of great interest to people like Jed, who've been keeping us entertained in between the panels all this week. But before I go into any further into those kinds of details, what prompted you to start researching online streaming behavior? Sorry.
Well, so first, so I've been watching a lot of live music streams since the early days of the practice. So from like 2012, 2013, when it was the very beginning. And so when I did my bachelor degree about 3 years ago, I started to look at it with more of an academic eye. And I realized that there was almost no research made about live streaming, while there was a lot of research made about game live streams, you know. And so I started my research to try to fill in the gap. And so while I was doing my research about this, you know, music-related aspects such as copyrights, the use of the practice as a new promotional tool, I've quickly became fascinated by the live chat, which is this space, you know. It's either beside or underneath the video player, and, you know, the viewers can exchange between each other and they can send messages to the streamers as well. And I found fascinating, yeah, the way that viewers are truly bonding with each other and with the streamers as well through this little space there. And so, yeah, in a sense, like, I felt that the chat was becoming a space to reinvent social relationships, you know, because these viewers, they do not see each other, they do not know each other, but they still interact and they still, you know, have true relationship through space. So yeah, and so I've been watching the live music streams on Facebook and YouTube, and the game live stream for leisure on Twitch. This is how the platform were basically working. It's changing a bit right now, but yeah, anyway. And so I wonder, is there a difference between these three platforms, you know, in terms of agency and functionalities through the live chat, in terms of behaviors as well, especially, you know, with Facebook, who try to have real profiles on the platform, whereas on Twitch and YouTube, you can basically be anonymous if you'd like. Is there a difference between the music community and the gaming community when it comes to watch a live stream, you know, when they interact with each other? And so at first, I thought that, well, there must be a difference between Facebook and YouTube and Twitch on the other side, because, you know, on Facebook, you have a real name, you have your, most often, a real profile picture.
Absolutely.
There are details about your life, your friends, your relatives, your work, and so on. And so, you might tend to behave better on Facebook rather than on Twitch and YouTube. And so actually it doesn't quite work like that. So I found that what was the main factor that provoked the negative conduct was the crowd. So basically, the more people are watching live streams, and more likely you'll have to adopt some negative conduct because you just feel that you're hidden in this mass of people, and so that the identity context of the platform was not so important. And on the other side, on a more positive side, I found that it was also fascinating how the viewers have managed to establish communities, to kind of self-regulate the chat, and that they could solve the internal conflicts, just between themselves. They didn't need any outside intervention. And that thanks to these watchful communities, then the streamers would not have to enforce the community guidelines by themselves, and so they could focus on making the best out of their performances. And so that was really
I think this is really interesting, especially how it kind of fits into some similar research that's been done into other kinds of games moderation. Why do you think that community-based moderation is so effective?
Well, so I think there are several factors that explain why it's more effective than, let's say, robot or algorithm moderation. So I think that first, it gives the community a sense of purpose, which is obviously at the advantage of the streamer, because they make the audience participate in the live stream, and therefore they make it more interactive. It gives viewer a role, in contributing to the good atmosphere of the live stream, which I believe is very important based on the community aspect of the practice, itself. And then, so I distinguish two kind of negative behaviors. So I would, make a distinction between the unpurposed negative behavior, which is this user who purposely, have a negative conducts. And there's this not unpurposed behavior. So, sometimes you've got this viewer who have negative behaviors, but they might think it's a joke, and so for the unpurposed negative behaviors, I think that the community-based moderation helps calling them out, because they are being highlighted by the community, and so it just makes them stupid, and so nobody wants to look stupid in front of other people. So next time you think about having a bad behavior, you probably think twice about it. So I think for that is good. And for the not on purpose behaviors, and I'm thinking about what happens on LGBT streams, female streams, for people of color who do streams as well. As I said, sometimes you've got these users and they throw what think are some silly jokes about physical appearance, belonging to a certain group, and these kind of things. And so the community-based moderation gives a chance to talk to them, and so explain why they shouldn't adopt such behavior, because I think it's much more efficient than having a robot blocking you, or timing you out, because what you're going to do, you're just going to move onto another stream and you're going to repeat your behavior, all over again, and it's basically never going to end. While the community-based moderation gives a chance to educate them, and tell them how they are negatively impacting the experience of the streamer and of the other users as well. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I'm sure many of us can speak to this experience from online communities that we've been participating in, and online events that we've been going to during lockdown. Not just in music, but also things like comedy and cabaret. I've been quite impressed with the ways that people like John Robertson handle this kind of thing in kind of community moderation in their streams. So do you think community moderation is the way forward?
Well, and I think in the case of so for these a bit more well-produced events that we can find for comedy, as you said, like cabaret, this kind of thing, like even live music gigs, I think it's even more important, because the comedian, the musicians, the players, it also works for esport tournament, when in most cases you've got these actors who are on a stage, you know, so you've got this TV-like constraint, which so they won't have a direct access to the chat window, or they just can't follow the chat because they have to focus on the work they're doing, you know. But still, the chat remains a huge part of the experience for the viewers, you know. And so the people who organize this show, who manage this show, I think they really have to understand that it's still crucial to regulate them, you know. And I think it's even more true for what you said about these things that are usually happening outside of the live streaming realm, you know, such as cabaret, comedy, and live music, most notably, because the community that are new to live streaming, they might not know, they might not have the same understandings as the, you know, game communities who are quite aware of how live streaming is taking place. And so I think that it can really ruin the experience, and you might have this kind of clash of communities when you've got these new communities and these a bit more aware communities, and who might, you know, so some might know the inherent rules of live streaming and some might not, you know. And I think that if you have real people to moderate, they can really act as, you know, conductors, you know, and so then improve the overall experience for everyone. So for the organizers, for the streamers, for the broadcasters, for the viewers, for, yeah, basically everyone. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a much more understanding way of kind of dealing with this and helping people to interact more in a more helpful way online. I think I know some examples have been. I can't monitor the chat completely, but I understand some examples have been put in there as well. So we're going to move on to audience questions in just a bit. So keep those coming into the chat. But first of all, I'd like to invite all our speakers to unmute for some group questions. So if you'd like to do that. The first and most obvious question I guess I can ask all of you is that how did game studies come into your career? Was it something that was baked in right at the start of this work? Is it something that you sort of came into later? How was your game studies research side of things sort of involved in the work you're doing now?
Okay, well, I'll go first, I guess. I had the distinct honor of being one of the very first students at Abertay University when it first opened 26 years ago. Bit painful to say. However, game studies did not exist then. I did psychology and biology. So the idea of being able to study games at university didn't exist, and I wouldn't have even known it was a thing. Abertay did come out with the first ever games design course, but I was living in China and far too old at that point to take it. So it was just a love of games and seeing how my own research and interests could also tie in another love in my life, which was games. So for me, that was my journey.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a moment there to say that my first interaction with game studies was actually through psychology as well. That was the first time I did any game studies research. But yes, Arthur, Gabe, either of you two want to jump in here?
Yeah, well, so I'm not really into game studies, but I think my subject touches game studies. So as I said earlier, there's been a lot of literature that has been written about game live streams, and so I absolutely need to draw into this research to make. So what I'm doing is that I'm taking the more commercial aspect for my research into the music literature and the very specific technical moderation socialities into the gaming literature, which has been researching live stream for a few years now, and so I'm trying to merge the two. Yeah, so this is how it got into my studies.
Excellent. Gabe, how about you?
So I guess I came from an English literature background, but I'd always tried to write about games. Sometimes it went well, sometimes the tutors didn't quite get what I was trying to do, which is fine. But coming to Glasgow, there was a fantasy across media week, and I never felt like when I was doing literature stuff, like I liked it, but it never felt like the right thing. And then we had the week where the previous cohort had suggested that there should be a fantasy across media course, and there was a game studies week, and I found the game studies reading group, and I was like, aha, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Very cool. So it was a case of making my own path, really, and being lucky about being in the right place at the right time. But I had also heard that Scotland was like big for games, and you've got stuff coming up like Scottish Games Network and things like that. So it's, you know, it's like a good place to position oneself for further involvement with video games. So it's like strategic, but also very lucky too.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely worth us highlighting Scottish Games Network again. But I think it's kind of interesting that that all of us have kind of come to this sort of from different paths as game studies has kind of emerged over the last 20 years or so. The other question that I'd like to ask before we move into audience questions, and we've already tapped into this a little bit, but I was wondering how the pandemic has affected the reception / possible reception of your work and what you've been doing.
Well, yeah, I don't know who wants to start.
Well,
so mine is going to be very, very, very short. So I've been positively affected by the COVID-19 in terms of my research, because as many entertainers had to turn into live streaming to broadcast their work, it just raised a huge interest in the eyes of the general public. So it gives me so much more material to work on than I was initially supposed to have. So for me, it was actually not so bad. Yeah.
Charlie, did you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my own research, getting my game out and tested, it's had, you know, kind of a negative impact slightly. But in terms of the Kilted Otter initiative, it's had such a positive impact because we were right on the cusp of people being tired of being isolated. So something that started as a drunken idea with a friend is now supported by the Scottish Government, Bord na Gaelid, MG Alaba, and Abertay University. So that's, you know, I'm not thankful for the virus, but it's had a positive output on or impact on what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So for me, I'd like to kind of answer on a professional level and a slightly personal level. So on a professional level, it's been great because people are more interested in games and seeing the value in them more, which makes my work more appealing, which is fantastic. On a personal level, actually, like, I have a lifelong mental illness, and I always found it extremely difficult to get out and network with people and do things because I get very tired and there's only so many spoons in the day, you know. So it's been a really nice opportunity in a positive way to like kind of help me get out and do more stuff which is online. And I've been really lucky to have the space to meet some fantastic people and run a reading group with people across the country and meet loads of fantastic people that I probably wouldn't have had the chance to meet. So as hard as it is, it's like been trying to turn it into a positive. Like, I've had so many amazing opportunities in the past few months because things are online, and I feel like for some people online things are more accessible, and I hope that going forward we have a more kind of hybrid society that keeps the feeling of accessibility and kind of like connection in unconventional ways.
Excellent. Those are some very thoughtful answers. I just want to say, if you've been affected by any of the issues that that Gabe mentioned, I'm quite happy to have people to slide into my DMs about related issues. Gabe, I don't know how you feel about doing this stuff online, but I'll be in the chat for a little while after this. If anyone wants to talk about networking when you're affected by these kinds of issues. Excellent. Okay. So we have a whole bunch of questions from the chat that I'm going to just dive into here. First of all, we've got a question from Claire. A question perhaps for Gabe, but also everyone. To what extent do you think that gameplay can enhance feelings of real world empathy, changing of viewpoints, etc., perhaps more so than other art forms can do?
So what I would say is, so that my answer to this is twofold, and I'll try and keep it brief. So the first answer is, it's really great because in games, you know, we have more agency and more interactivity. So there's various things that I'm exploring in my research that can make us feel more connected to things or give us another viewpoint. However, what I would also say is that we also need to, which is why I'm very pro media literacy, I'm very pro digital media literacy, because I feel like we need to analyze these things. If these things can have an effect on us, we need to, they're all different. No, like screen time isn't created equal. We need to know the kinds of things that we're doing and the kinds of fantasies we're inhabiting, because what we also don't want to do is have a false sense of empathy, right? So you can play games and you can think you know an experience, but you might not necessarily. And I think what's amazing at the moment is developers who are getting more like diverse voices on board. So it's that other thing of like nothing about us without us, right? So it's great. So for example, in Hellblade, you have like consultants that looked at mental health, like you're bringing in experts to contribute to your narrative and make sure that the stories you are telling like aren't detrimental and aren't providing a false sense of empathy. Because you know, there's only, if we're too trusting in things, it's all very well like playing for fun and leisure time is fantastic, but if we want to take a lesson from it, we kind of need to be kind of critically minded and kind of understand the content that we're consuming.
Absolutely. I'd like to move on to a question here for Charlie, because we've got about 5 minutes left. Charlie, Jack is wondering, would like to hear a bit about how you practically make some of the participatory approaches that you mentioned in the work in games, apps, technology, challenges around this as well. I'm not sure if this is an organizational type question or whether this is a technical question. So
Hopefully
take
not
it away.
technical, because I'm not a technical person. But I think for me, I'm not a particularly social person. So online interaction, I've been more interactive or social with people than I ever was before lockdown. And that kind of, once you break that barrier of feeling like an idiot talking into the void, then it actually becomes quite easy to interact. And so a lot of the participation that we're doing, particularly with the Kilted Altar, is entirely online. Even if, you know, life goes back to normal, fingers crossed very soon, it's still going to be online because we're taking down the barriers of distance. I mean, I know for myself, I've given about 3 or 4 keynotes at conferences in Colombia and Mexico. This is something I could never have done. So enabling or using the internet as a conduit for to be able to communicate and participate and collaborate is something that I think, as Gabe said, going forwards, I don't think that will ever disappear. I think conferences will always have an online kind of element to them because the people going to conferences have increased exponentially, because you don't need to take time off work. You don't need to pay for a hotel or a flight or whatever. And so all of the stuff we're doing is all online. And so for example, the teaching of the app, we'll be setting up a video call and we'll be, I'll be screen sharing and just step by step telling or teaching Mr. Switzer how to make an app so that he can then take that knowledge and pass it on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, especially as someone on a restricted budget with a physical disability, I would have thought twice about going to a lot of international events and workshops that I've actually been able to attend this time around. So that's a very good point. Thank you. I'm gonna go for one final question. I think we've got time for, and then we'll see what our time is like after that. This question comes from Jed, and it's for Gabe, but I also think it's something that that Arthur might like to speak to as well, which is, for me, the whole live streaming music thing has been about how to share the culture of a folk music session or an open mic over a live stream. Very good point here. So it's about trying to share an open collaborative space rather than just being a straightforward performer just presenting to an audience. Does this resonate with anything that you've been looking at? And I'd like to invite Gabe and Arthur to answer this one.
Do you want to go first, Arthur?
All right. So I think the two can cohabit very well, because I think it's very two separate things. You know, you can have these well-produced shows when, you know, it's like an artist on stage, and to have this kind of hybrid vibe. So let's say that, you know, in a few years' time, people will be in a venue, but people will also be attending the event while watching a stream. So you won't have to have this, I mean, there will always be an interactive side of it, but it won't be as necessary as it would be if it's just you and your fans or your community, you know, doing a wee live stream from your flat or your studio or your bedroom or whatever. So I think that, you know, we should not oppose you know, the two ways of making live stream, and that they should cohabit so we can all make the most out of it. Yeah.
Okay, and Gabe?
So I guess it's I suppose it depends what you're talking about. So if you're talking about live streaming, or I suppose like what interests me in a way is that the social interactions that we have with video game characters that make them feel more real, they stem from techniques used, which I'll be looking at in my talk later, in like more conventional media like television and film and things like that. So that also brings in the question of, when we're live streaming, when we're talking to people, some of that is as much a persona construction as perhaps talking to a video game character, right? Because we're all people, and to an extent we're all authentic, but we also have our different faces that we wear in different personas. And that's probably very, like, you know, when people are live streaming and things like that, that's where stuff gets complicated, because you might have these relationships with people on social media, or people that are streamers that you hang out with, and you're using them to decrease your social deficit and to hang out. But how much is it them? Like, which part of them is it? And how much energy is that person using up to also entertain you, to make you feel welcome? And a lot of this is, you know, emotional labor that people are giving. And sometimes it's fantastic, but if you look at some of the really grueling schedules of streamers, like, it's incredibly difficult. And because it just looks like people are existing on screen just as themselves, it doesn't necessarily take into consideration the emotional labor and the difficulties that some people face surrounding social interaction. So as much as it's authentic and it's great for connection, there is also always that kind of performative element and that kind of energy element that goes in with the social interaction as well. So I hope that answers a little bit, even if it's a bit cynical, I'm afraid.
I actually think that this may be the start of a longer question that a longer debate that we could have in the chat later on, regarding the nature of sort of our online personalities and the way we kind of conduct ourselves on live streams. Not to think too much about what I'm doing while I'm doing it. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to Charlie Harbord, Gabriel Elvery, Arthur Ellinger for joining me.